the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about a number of issues in the news, and certainly to lead off, let's point out the fact that Matt Gaetz, who stepped down from the House of Representatives and actually had his name put forward as the next Attorney General in the Trump administration, has resigned. He said the Ethics Committee investigation into his allegations was something that was too much of a distraction for Donald Trump and his incoming administration. So he said on X, "There's no time to waste on a needlessly protracted Washington scuffle. Thus, I'll be withdrawing my name from consideration to serve as Attorney General. Trump's Department of Justice must be in place and ready on day one." Goes on to say, "I will be forever honored that President Trump nominated me to lead the Department of Justice, and I'm certain he will save America." So that is certainly something that we probably could have predicted. The line around a lot of people is when it came time to fill out your bingo card, I don't think anybody had Matt Gaetz on the bingo card as the Attorney General. That being said, I think some of us had on the bingo card the possibility that he might actually withdraw. Not because he may or may not have been qualified, but he can count like anyone else. And when you don't have the requisite number of votes in the United States Senate, and every single day there's a constant drumbeat against your nomination, you can see the problem. And of course, there was an attempt to try to prevent some of this by a philosophy that the Trump administration or the transition team has developed, which I guess I could call flood the zone. Now, what do I mean by that? Flood the zone, if you've watched football at all, know that certainly the quarterback and the offense on football, if they're playing against zone defense, will put an enormous number of individuals in that particular zone area and thus flood the zone. There are too many people for the defenders to attack simultaneously, too many people for the defenders to defend against. And that seems to be the strategy that was implemented by this transition team by Donald Trump. And that is, they learned their lesson from 2016 and 2017, because one of the first people they put out was Lieutenant General Michael Flynn as the National Security Advisor. And because he was out there sort of on a lone post, there was all sorts of attacks came against him, and also some underhanded tactics. I won't even get into all of those. And as a result, that was the end of the possibility that actually Michael Flynn would serve as National Security Advisor to Donald Trump. This time you had day after day after day, usually 2 or 3 additional nominees put forward. And so it makes it a little bit harder to focus on whether it's Tulsi Gabbard or Robert Kennedy Jr. or whether it is Pete Hegseth, some of the ones that are perhaps a little bit more controversial, if you will, when they're mixed in with, of course, we've talked about the fact that you have some individuals that will be serving that I would think would be a little less controversial. But even the other day, we had people looking at the fact that they might even go after some of the people that would be almost quasi-establishment. So nevertheless, this idea of flooding the zone was really an idea of putting most of the nominees out there almost simultaneously. In the last week and a half, I think he's pretty much filled out his cabinet. And I gave up even trying to mention the name of each individual, although next week, one of our guests who is with the Danforth organization, or Danbury Institute, I should say, actually will take some time to maybe talk about what is happening in each one of those cabinet positions, who those people are, and the rest. So we will get into some of that next week. Next week, of course, is Thanksgiving week, and I figure we'll get away from some of the day-to-day politics and kind of look a little bit more long-term to what is happening. But nevertheless, this idea of flood the zone may have protected a few of the other nominees, but the first one to actually step down is Matt Gaetz. And if you've just heard it here for the first time, it was just announced recently, and I think we'll see what happens in the future. By the way, I should mention that if indeed we do have a confirmation of a U.S. Senator from Florida, there'll be an open spot, and some people think that it is possible that Ron DeSantis might put him in that position as senator. So we'll see where that goes. Just before we get into some of the business in the news, since I'm picking out a few of these small items, let's just keep on that particular focus, because some of these small items are big issues, but they're kind of small news stories. And one of those comes from Illinois, and that is the Supreme Court in the state of Illinois has overturned the conviction of Jussie Smollett in the hate crime hoax. And so this is something that was done because originally he was actually found not guilty. So then, because of some of the public pressure, a special prosecutor was then impaneled to try him again after the previous charges had been dropped. And again, if you're not familiar with the story, we've talked about it before, simply because from time to time I do like to talk about the real danger of some of these fake hate crimes in terms of what it has done for the public perception, the waste of police resources, and the fact that anybody seemingly can make an allegation and the police have to take it seriously until finally we prove the person innocent. And then where do they go to get their good name back? But in this particular case, it was a false report that he filed back in January of 2019, claimed he'd been attacked by two men who shouted racial and homophobic slurs, had a Make America Great hat on and a variety of other things, wrapped a rope around his neck, and said the assault took place in one of the coldest nights in Chicago. I've been to Chicago many times working with our friends at Moody Bible, but it's hard to even believe any of that. But nevertheless, it turns out that he paid two brothers to stage the attack, that he was actually found to have purchased the rope and all the rest. And so he, matter of fact, paid these two men $3,500. So after the decision to drop the charges, that's when the former Cook County Judge Michael Tuman appointed a U.S. attorney to actually pursue the case again. And so he was found guilty the second time of these refiled charges. Well, it turns out, even so, he never served any time. He was released on his personal recognizance bond. My producer and I like to talk about personal recognizance. That means you recognize yourself. Anyway, it's a joke that we use every once in a while when they use that phrase. But nevertheless, he actually might have lost the bond, but everything else, never served any time. And I think it's just a reminder, and probably the most visible reminder. If you ever listen to my daily commentaries, about once a year, sometimes twice a year if need be, I talk about all the fake hate crimes out there. Well, I've got a few here for the end of 2024. Believe me, there's some incredible ones there. And these are doing incredible damage. And so I do talk about that. But probably the most visible and best known fake hate crime is the Jussie Smollett hate crime. For those of you in Illinois, well, your Supreme Court thought he's suffered enough in the court of public opinion. I'm not sure I agree, but anyway, that's the latest news story. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Chuck Bentley is the CEO of Crown Financial and the host of the daily radio program My Money Life. He was on my radio program last week to talk about this question he received from a listener. That listener said, I am really concerned with what Elon Musk said about America headed towards bankruptcy. Do you think there's anything we need to do if he turns out to be correct? Well, Elon Musk was on a recent All-In Summit hosted by the All-In podcast in which he said, America is going bankrupt extremely quickly, and everyone seems to be sort of whistling past the graveyard on this one. Chuck Bentley attributes most of this problem to the promotional popularity of what is called modern monetary theory. Now, the economists and politicians believe our currency is sort of like monopoly money. They argue that we can ignore deficits and ignore the growing national debt, that the government will always be able to print enough money to pay its debts. But he warns we're headed for a downward debt loop. Now, during the program, I explained that we weren't the only people concerned about this. Chuck Bentley quotes from an individual by the name of Les Rubin in an article who admitted the government can pay their loans due to their unlimited ability to borrow for now or to print more money, as long as other countries and investors will continue to buy our bonds. But then in the article, he warned that this will eventually stop and will have to default, leading to severe consequences. So both Chuck Bentley and I concluded that if Elon Musk and the proposed Government Efficiency Commission cannot reduce spending, then the economic future of this country isn't very bright. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend some time now talking about the department that we're going to actually call a department, even though it will not actually be a department, the Department of Government Efficiency, oftentimes called Doge, so we use that as well. Very good piece written by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. But let me just mention the rest of the program here, because at the bottom of the hour, Dr. Tony Kriz is going to be with us. We're going to talk about the Children's Literacy Project. I think you'll appreciate that ministry and organization that he has put together. Next hour, David Bahnsen will be with us for a little bit of time. And, of course, he has certainly been a defender of free market economics and has written some books. There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. And, of course, when we talked with him last time about full-time work and meaning of life, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact that, for example, this Doge Plan and even some of the other Trump plans, what that will mean for the economy. Then we'll get back to some news in the area. One of those, give me fertility or give me death. It's a turn of phrase there, but it just reminds us that no matter who is elected, and in this case now we sort of have a pretty good idea who is elected to both the House, the Senate, and to the White House, some of these intractable problems don't go away. And one of those is the remarkable decrease in fertility. So we'll talk about that and some environmental issues and much more. But let me come to this particular article. This appeared in the Wall Street Journal. It's very well written. I suspect Vivek wrote a good portion of it. But they start with this claim that, and I think it is very true, our nation was founded on the basic idea that the people we elect run the government. This isn't how America functions, they say. Most legal edicts aren't laws enacted by Congress, but rules and regulations promulgated by unelected bureaucrats and tens of thousands of them each year. I might just point you to a book that I've been reading through by Vivek Ramaswamy, Truths, The Future of America First. And in his truths, one of the 10 truths is the fact that there are 3 branches of government, not 4. But he's talking about the fact that this 4th unelected bureaucracy, which has not been tamed oftentimes either by Congress or by the executive branch, sort of does a lot of the work of governing, and that was not what was intended. Also, I might point you to Ned Ryan's book. I've held it up a couple of times here, and we'll probably do some interviews with him in the future, American Leviathan. But again, these are both books to remind us of this very significant fact. They go on and say that this anti-democratic and antithetical to the founder's vision, it really is imposing a very direct and indirect cost on taxpayers because, as he says, it's antithetical. Thankfully, we have a historic opportunity to solve the problem, and that is the president, of course, has asked the 2 of them to lead a newly formed Department of Government Efficiency. I don't think it actually is going to be a department, but we'll just keep calling it that since that's what everybody else calls it. And he says, we are assisting the Trump transition team to identify and hire a team of small group and small government crusaders, including some of the sharpest technical and legal minds in America. The team will work in the new administration closely with the White House Office of Management and Budget. They go on to say that our North Star for reform will be the U.S. Constitution, with a focus on 2 critical Supreme Court rulings issued during President Biden's tenure. The first of those is West Virginia versus EPA. The justices held that agencies can't impose regulations dealing with major economic or policy questions unless Congress specifically authorizes them to do so. That has been a very strong statement that has come from the Supreme Court. And then the more recent one that happened this year is the one having to do with the Chevron doctrine, which we've talked about a little bit with Kelly Shackelford, which says that federal courts should no longer defer to federal agencies' interpretations or their law or rulemaking authority. And so they argue that these 2 cases really provide an open window, because a lot of us who've been around for a while remember when we had the Grace Commission. And J. Peter Grace put it together. He paid for it himself. It issued its results in 1984, and yet not much came of it. A little bit, but not much. I think there were a couple of mistakes they're going to try to fix. One I talked about the other day, they're going to be much more transparent. Instead of having a group sequestered off and doing all the research and then issuing a report, they're going to be posting. Of course, now we have social media. We didn't have as much back then. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're going to, here's one that we're recommending. Here are some just incredible non-common sense policies that have been implemented, on and on and on. And that's the first issue. Number 2, we have a court that has ruled much more in favor of what could be an open door. So it is quite possible that this Department of Government Efficiency, known as Doge, could be more effective than the Grace Commission was a number of years ago. And you probably guessed by now I'm going to be writing a commentary about that. But let's continue on, because then they go on to say that they will present a list of regulations to President Trump, who can, by executive order, pause these particular enforcements. If there have been places where the government has, in this case, the bureaucracy has ruled in ways that Congress is not allowed, he can pause those. Now, again, they already anticipate the criticism, because they say when the president nullifies these regulations, critics will allege that this is executive overreach. In fact, they argue it will be correcting executive overreach of thousands of regulations promulgated by administrative fiat that were never authorized by Congress. And then they also want to spend some time, as they say, to work with embedded appointees in agencies to identify the minimum number of employees required at an agency for it to perform its constitutional, permissible, and statutorily mandated functions. The number of federal employees to cut should be at least proportionate to the number of federal regulations that are nullified. which then raises the next question that you probably will hear, and that is, they say that conventional wisdom holds that statutory civil service protections stop the president or even his political appointees from firing federal workers. The purpose, of course, of these protections is to protect employees from political retaliation. But they then point out the statute allows for reductions in force that don't target specific employees. The statute further empowers the president to prescribe rules governing the competitive service, and the power is fairly broad, and they then quote two Supreme Court decisions from 1992, Franklin versus Massachusetts, another one from 2021, Collins versus Yellen. And the point that he's making again is we can't necessarily remove Bob and Sue and Jim and Sarah, but we can reduce the number in the department by 4. I just picked 4 there for a minute, and they can figure out which ones they want to get rid of. But the point is, it's not political retaliation. It's just the reduction of the size and scope of government. Pretty good. Finally, we're focused on delivering cost savings to taxpayers. Skeptics question how much federal spending Doge can tame through executive action alone. And they point to the 1974 Empowerment Control Act. I do remember that. But Mr. Trump has previously suggested the statute is unconstitutional, and more to the point, the current Supreme Court is likely to side with him as well. That came about at a time when Richard Nixon did not have a lot of power, and there was a lot of push against him, and I suspect that this could be another one of those cases. Just as in 1973 there was the idea of Roe versus Wade, which more recently was actually struck down by the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision, I think this particular issue of the Empowerment Control Act could be struck down as well by this current Supreme Court. The point they're making is this. The door seems wide open. You have, first of all, the election of a Republican president, a Republican House, a Republican Senate. You have a number of Supreme Court decisions that have opened the door significantly, and you have a Supreme Court with at least a 6-3, sometimes even a 7-2 majority, depending on what you look at there, that might provide for historic opportunity for the reduction in the size and scope of the federal government. We'll see where it goes, but this is a very well-written piece, as you probably have gathered. 4 pages. It is our first article, and if you are wanting to understand what you think Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to do, I would recommend that you read it. And I might just mention, as a program note, tomorrow we're going to be talking about an editorial that appeared in the USA Today about this as well, from another individual looking at what this might mean for the American people. So we'll take a break. We'll come back and we'll spend some time talking with Tony Kriz, and then we'll a little bit later give you a chance to join the conversation if you'd like to do so. A lot that we are covering today here on Point of View. If you'd like to find out more about the guests we have on here, the articles we've posted, just feel free to go to the website, which is pointofview.net. Let's come back and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this Children's Literacy Project. Maybe one of the best ways to address the issue of poverty in America. We'll be right back.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
This half hour, we're going to spend some time talking about literacy, but in particular, the connection between illiteracy and poverty. If you cannot read in this modern 21st century world, it just eliminates you from so much. And so we do want to talk about the Children's Literacy Project. And in order to get some perspective on that, we bring to the microphone Dr. Tony Kriz, again, an individual that received his Doctor of Ministry from Portland Seminary, has served on the faculty at Warner Pacific University, Multnomah Seminary, and Portland Seminary. He writes a monthly column in Christianity Today's Leadership Journal. Might point you to one that I found very interesting, that mysterious gospel, because so often when we talk about evangelism, we're quoting what Paul says, but Paul most of the time is a Christian talking to Christians. He suggests we go back to the book of Acts, which is revealing, to see what was happening when Christians were talking to non-Christians. Anyway, it's an interesting piece, along with many others that he's written as well. He is the founder, the theologian, and creative director of the Children's Literacy Project. And so, Dr. Kriz, great to have you on the program today.
Kerby, so great for you to invite me. I love the fact that we're here together, and you brought up that article. That's really lovely. That was a very evocative piece. It got a lot of conversation started.
Well, it's one that generated it. Yeah, as they say, it went viral, I guess. I don't know if it went viral, but it started conversations anyway. As an individual that's lived in Oregon, and every year I fly into the Portland airport and then go and speak at Ecola, which is over there at Cannon Beach. I'm familiar with some of the things you do at Portland. But let's get into this, because you have, of course, have written a number of books, and I will certainly, as we go through this, mention those. But first of all, I would encourage people to go to the Children's Literacy Project.org, because that will tell you about the particular book called Read, although it's one of many books that you've written. But let's talk about that, because that, I think, is a way of looking at this issue of poverty and the culture of poverty in a little different way, and that is to look at the issue of literacy. Can you help us out?
Yeah, so Read, subtitled How God's People Can Bring Justice Through Literacy, is we've been in the church-school relationship space now for about 15 years, me and my partners at the Children's Literacy Project. We've had just tremendous opportunities to set up tens of thousands of churches with partnerships with local schools, just doing acts of service, acts of love, acts of compassion, raking leaves or scraping gum or doing whatever the schools need. That so many of our schools are so underfunded these days, and they just don't have the resources to do some of the basic things that my schools growing up had no problem pulling off. But what we realized over time is that if you want to make real systemic impact, you want to make long-term impact, both in the hearts of the people who are volunteering, the churches who are volunteering, but also in the lives of the children and the teachers, by the way, that we're serving, literacy is the single best way that an everyday citizen can really change the life of another person. One in three fourth graders today are reading at the lowest levels. And children who do not learn to read by fourth grade, we stop teaching reading at fourth grade.
Right.
And after that, there are no resources for reading. And if a child does not learn to read by fourth grade, statistically, they will never read. And 1.3 million children are currently illiterate in the fourth grade. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, 1.3 million children drop out of school every year. And those children are our future. They're going to fill our future welfare lines. They're going to fill our future prison cells. They're going to fill our future walking the streets, addicts, filling our hospitals, the very people that Jesus spoke about that we're supposed to love as much as you've done it to me. As long as you've done it the least of these, you've done it unto me. These children are the future people that Jesus was talking about.
One of the things I appreciate about that is you're kind of looking upstream rather than downstream. Sometimes we're trying to deal with the problems when they develop. And, of course, the Gospels call on us to actually uplift the least of these. Every time I hear the word least of these, I just think about just the other day, if people are not familiar, Dr. Tony Campolo, who I've known, just passed on. And but nevertheless, when we talk about the gospel and we talk about what we can do, sometimes people say, well, this issue of poverty is just so overwhelming. Well, then deal with it in a systematic way, because even when I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I only became a Christian a little bit later, but I was hired out, and I was actually volunteered. I never got paid a penny for it, to actually teach reading and teach math in some of these underprivileged areas, which is more up in Richmond, California, because we recognized if you can solve the problem in the grade schools, you don't have to deal with the problem in the high schools and afterwards. Is that fair?
That's fair. We call it preventative justice. We talk about preventative health care all the time. That's the wise place to put your money, as opposed to reacting when people have problems. We call it preventative justice. How do we help people have the tools early on in life so they never get to the point that we're having to fund a massive prison complex? We're not having to fund massive welfare systems. How do we get to people and give them the resources so they can have a future and a hope? I love the fact you brought up Dr. Campolo. I've known Tony for many, many years. 25 years ago, I was a young theology student, and I was sitting in front of a room surrounded by pastors of large churches and heads of big Christian agencies, and Dr. Campolo and I were talking, and he looked at me and he said, "Young theologian," is what he said, which if you know Tony, that won't surprise you. "Young theologian, what is our theology of the poor?" He put me on the spot in front of this room. And I must admit, I was on my heels. Seminary had not trained me to have an answer to that question. And he looked at me again with compassion, but stern. "What is our theology of the poor?" When I couldn't answer the question, he said, "Young theologian, our theology of the poor is when we look into the eyes of the poor, we look into the face of Jesus."
Good line.
"As much as you've done it to the least of these, you have
Least
done
of
it
these.
unto me." And I've been training pastors for 2 decades. And one of the things that pastors tell me all the time is that their people, their congregants, have beautiful hearts. They want to love the poor. They want to love the tossed aside, the forgotten, the least. They want to. They don't know how. Like the idea of walking into a prison and like starting a prison Bible study or something just feels overwhelming to most congregants. The idea of working at a soup kitchen sometimes feels scary and I don't know, or unsafe. The idea of going to an immigration camp just to show compassion, just feels like I wouldn't know what to do and I wouldn't know what to say. You know what's not intimidating? An 8-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
An 8-year-old from an under-resourced home,
Right.
an under-resourced school is absolutely not intimidating. And what we're seeing across the country right now is unbelievable number of churches that are saying, we want to get involved with the forgotten, and all of us know how to read. So let's go make a difference in this really powerful area. And Kerby, we live in a world today where the neighborhood has been abandoned. And in our consumerism and our commuterism, there are only 2 institutions that still exist in every neighborhood in America: the grade school and the local church. And we want to hook those two institutions up and see a transformation of an entire generation, that we would stop being 125th in the world in literacy according to World Book Encyclopedia.
Amazing.
And we would once again return to being one of the great education countries in the world. Among developed countries, they say that we're 32nd out of 35 developed countries in literacy. America peaked in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we were leading the world in education. Today, we are 32nd out of 35 developed countries in literacy. And we got to see a change. And we all want a better country. We all want a better future. We all want better neighborhoods. And this is one of the ways we can do it.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can get involved individually and how your church can. First of all, let me just point you to children'sliteracyproject.org. They have a lot of key resources: getting started, school relations, why, mentoring, and the rest. When we come back, I do want to talk with Tony about the film Sentenced, because there's a way in which you can screen that. Of course, we have a trailer that you can watch. The book, Read, How God's People Can Bring Justice Through Literacy. You can learn more about that. And of course, we've even put up a separate link there as well to the book that has come out here in September. And if you would want to get a copy of the book, and I think you might want to, that is the case. And of course, all of that is available through the website pointofview.net. So just even during the break, you might get near a computer, check out children'sliteracyproject.org. When we come back, I'm going to have Tony talk about, first of all, what you can do as an individual, not anything terribly threatening about wanting to help an 8-year-old learn how to read, and most importantly, how you and your church can be involved, because this is a movement that we hope would be expanded even by this broadcast today. So let's take a break. We'll come back and talk more about the Children's Literacy Project right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Tony Kriz with us as we talk about the Children's Literacy Project. And Tony, first of all, I've just got to say that I'm so impressed with your website because it is really literally plug and play. You've got a section on getting started and a number of videos there, all the way to why mentoring and literacy champion and church resources. But I imagine by now people have heard enough of these very discouraging statistics about literacy and recognizing that if we really want to make a difference, I think a church needs to develop that. So talk about how we get started.
Thank you so much. And yeah, the website it's a new site. We've been working really hard on it. I've been developing a lot of the materials for it, and we just want it to be a catch-all so everyone feels like they can get started today. We hope, the long arc, we really hope that this country goes through a transformation, that we go through, our education system goes through a transformation, both nationally and locally. But in the meantime, we have to act. And the best way that we have found to really make change, and again, we have seen this in thousands of neighborhoods across the country, is for a church or a collection of churches to adopt a school and declare that that no child will get through fourth grade unable to read. We will commit to that and then have their congregants show up 1 hour a week. Anybody who's willing to volunteer, take one lunch hour, 1 hour a week, show up to that school and become the new best friend to an 8-year-old, to a 9-year-old, and just give them that one-on-one attention that so many children lack in their lives. So many of our children come from difficult homes where their parents are doing the best that they can, but maybe they're working multiple jobs, or it's a single-parent home, or they're living below the poverty line and struggling just to get through the things of life. And many kids today, with the loss of the extended family, with the loss of community engagement, they do not have one adult who really cares for them, shows up every week and says, hey, you're important, you're smart, you have a future and a hope, and let's spend time together reading one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. Let's get together and work on these skills together. So many of our teachers are overwhelmed. They're doing the best that they can, but their classrooms are overcrowded, and too many of their kids are so far behind that they never can help get ahead of the wave. But when a few volunteers come in from a local church and say, we want to love you, we want to care about you, and pull just a fraction of those kids out of the room, suddenly that teacher's got margin. Suddenly that teacher's got the ability to teach instead of just doing crisis control all the time. These are the things we want to bring to the classroom, and we've seen it happen. Down in Waco, Texas, local churches adopted the top 8 worst scoring schools in maybe the whole state, but certainly in that county in Texas, the 8 worst scoring in literacy in the entire state. Today, those 8 schools are the highest scoring schools because churches got involved and began mentoring programs in each one of those schools, and it transformed. And they're seeing those neighborhoods transform because those kids are coming home with less emotional problems. Suddenly those families are healthier and more engaged. The impact, the ripple effect, and I'm not even talking about what happens 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, when these kids suddenly enter the workforce and they have the skills to get a job, to contribute to society, to pay their taxes. Almost all of these illiterate kids, they grow up to become people who don't pay any taxes at all. They take from the system.
Yes.
And we end up carrying that burden. How do we make transformation? And this is one of the ways that we just believe the church can really have a tangible impact.
And one of the things I've noticed, as you were saying, 10 years down the road, our own church had done this where we had individuals that were going to teach reading in West Dallas, and out of that eventually developed the West Dallas Community School, and I've served on the West Dallas Community School Board for many years, and so you went from not only helping those kids to actually establishing a lighthouse in the midst of some of that really difficult circumstances and turning out individuals that were not only literate but doing very well going to college. But again, how can people get involved? It does seem to me that the first step is to fill out that form. There's a take action item, and you can say, well, I'd like to be a volunteer. Maybe I'd like to register some volunteers. Maybe a church. Talk about what that might entail, because I want to encourage people listening right now to sign up.
Yes, please go to children'sliteracyproject.org and just say, I want to get involved. Click on the button right there. And if you're an individual who wants to, what we'll do is we'll do a very, very short intake, and we'll get you hooked up with the best literacy organization in your local area. If you are a pastor or a leader of a faith community and you want to see how your entire community can get involved, or maybe adopt a school, go on, register your organization, register your church, and we will get back to you, and we will hook you up with the best literacy organization in your area to expedite the process so that your people are on the ground with a new 8-year-old best friend as soon as possible. Our goal is to make that so simple, because we want churches to be doing the work, to actually be in the lives of people, not worrying about figuring things out and doing research and doing administration. We want to take care of all of that so your people can tomorrow have a new best friend who is the least of these, the poor in spirit, as Jesus talked about.
And again, one of the videos is, are you a literacy church? So I'm hoping some of the listeners here will try to make their church a literacy church and part of that outreach.
Fantastic.
If people have a question, I know that sometimes they would like to talk to you. There's a get involved, but of course you're up there in Lake Oswego. I know where that is because my wife is from Kerby, Oregon, so that's just down the road.
Oh, wow.
But I think anybody could give you a call, and you do have a way in which people can contact you as well, don't they? Through email or then some of the links that we have?
Yes, sir. You can connect through Children's Literacy Project through the website, or quite frankly, TonyKriz at children'sliteracyproject.org if people want to contact me directly and ask questions. If maybe they've gotten the book Read and they want to talk about it and see some of the ways that we've applied the teachings of Jesus to this literacy crisis in America today, and how the church is the perfect answer. I would love to talk to anybody.
Let me just mention again, we have a link to the book, Read, How God's People Can Bring Justice Through Literacy. We have a link to the website. We also have a link to your Twitter feed, or of course now called X, and Facebook page. All of that is available, but the simplest way to get started, simply go to our website, pointofview.net, or go directly to children'sliteracyproject.org. Everything you need is right there, and I hope you'll contact Tony, and let's see if we can turn some of the churches that are associated with this radio program across the country involved. So, Tony, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I appreciate it. We're
going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. David Bahnsen will be with us, and of course, if you have maybe an interest in this, I just think there's a great opportunity to deal with this issue. I would rather deal with the problems that are going to unfold in the 21st century upstream rather than downstream. And if you cannot learn to read by the 4th grade, it is not a real positive outcome for you in the future. And it seems to me that there are some things that we can and should do. And after all, the church is going to be a lighthouse sometimes in the midst of a dark culture. Let's be the lighthouse, and let's see what we can do in terms of this issue of literacy. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some more issues. But if you go to the website today, you'll notice that my commentary is on debt and spending, which will get into, of course, some of the conversation we just had about Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, but also the conversation we're going to have in just a few minutes with David Bahnsen. But you'll also notice that we now have a banner up there saying Giving Tuesday. Giving Tuesday is just around the corner. It's December 3rd. And again, we would encourage you to want to join with us if you appreciate the kind of conversations that we have. Today, we talked about the Children's Literacy Project. Yesterday, we talked about a pregnancy resource center. We're talking about what's happening in the transition for Donald Trump and his new administration. We're getting into foreign policy issues. We'll be talking about religious liberty tomorrow with Kelly Shackelford. If you think that's worthy of your financial support, I hope that you would think that would be the case. I hope you might click on that button that says donate and support this ministry even before Giving Tuesday, and that's just around the corner. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time focusing on some of the topics we've already addressed. Of course, this last hour talked about this very important piece written by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy about the idea of trying to begin to limit the size scope of government, which comes from the Department of Government Efficiency. Also, my commentary today is on debt and spending and some of the topics we've addressed as well. And of course, we've recognized that no matter who the president was, we've had a staggering pace of new debt and increasing spending. So I really want to kind of get into that in more detail. And to do so, we bring back to the microphone David Bahnsen, who's a financial expert and a defender of the free market capitalist system. Under his management, right now, I think about $6 billion in client assets. He's the host of the Capital Record podcast. Might also mention we've posted a video so you can watch him in action on one of the segments on Fox News. And of course, he's the author of such books as There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths, and most recent time I had him on talking about full-time work and the meaning of life. David, welcome back to Point of View.
Oh, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin talk about the fact that we have potentially a new administration with potentially a new philosophy. I think we can pretty much assume that, even with all the uncertainty in our world. And as a person that looks at the business world, whether we talk about trying to bring about government efficiency, maybe trying to get the government to live within its means, those are going to be major tasks. But if we can begin to harness some of that, doesn't that provide some really positive outlook for the business community?
Well, look, anything that can enable us to right-size government would be good for the business community. I think that there's a lot of questions as to what they're going to be able to do and what ought to be done and so forth. I am cautiously optimistic that there will be some marginal improvement. But I think it's important people understand that the reason why right-sizing government is better for the private sector is a tautology. And what I mean by that is it's intrinsically true. Any resources not going to the government get redirected to somewhere else. And in this case, the somewhere else is where people most know how to efficiently use resources. People with a profit motive, people that have time and place experience in their given sector, people that are more qualified with the knowledge and the incentives to build things and do things. And so you still need a government, and some resources have to go to fund it, but all of those resources are effectively coming from a more productive area. And how do we know this? Because by definition, none of those resources go to the government on their own. They only go because they have to. And if it were the most rational and productive and optimal use, it would flow there by gravity, but it doesn't. And so it's a long answer to your question, but I do believe that anything that can improve efficiency and limit the size and waste of government would be a good thing. I don't think this is going to happen easily, though.
No. And again, one of the things I've said, and David, I've been kind of skeptical. I'm older. I'm as old as your father, who I knew very well as well, that I remember the Grace Commission in the 1980s, and great publication, many recommendations, not much happened. There are a few things that are different. First of all, they want to make it transparent as they go along, so people will be aware of that. Number two, they do talk about some of the Supreme Court decisions, one 2 years ago, one this year, that maybe open the door, and also a Supreme Court and a president that want to focus on it. It's one thing to give lip service to wanting to bring about some kind of change. It's another to have some people like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and a 6-3 Supreme Court that might uphold some of the actions. But again, I think we can be guardedly somewhat optimistic and see where that takes us. But you raised a good question, and that is every dollar that the government takes is a dollar that is not available in the capital market. And as an individual who is wanting to allow entrepreneurs to develop new products, new services, and the rest, in a sense, the government's always competing with you to actually be successful in the business world, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is an optimal size of government where they don't have to compete for more resources, where those of us in the business world, for example, benefit from not being invaded by a foreign country. And so there's some sense in which the necessary funding to keep us from being invaded by a foreign country is a good cost of business, right? And so if the government were funding those things that we as a society agreed were the legitimate function of government, then I don't think it is taking from the private sector. It's sort of much like government itself, securing it. It's securing the rights that are necessary, and that's what our Constitution talks about. And those are those powers that we give the government are given by we the people. The problem is when the government is doing things outside of its natural jurisdiction.
Right.
Now,
yes,
I have strong opinions. On what that jurisdiction ought to be. The Constitution has opinions. And I certainly welcome the idea that there may need to be a societal conversation as to what kind of government we want to have. And yet, I believe most people say that they think the government spends too much money. And what I don't understand is if people think the government spends too much money, what are all these things we're spending money on if they're not things the people have asked the government to spend money on? And you mentioned being familiar with my late father. I will tell you, this is one thing he said over and over and over again, and he's been gone from us now for almost 30 years. We have the government that we deserve.
Yeah,
we have the size government we deserve. And that's why from the Grace Commission to where we are now, and people say, oh, government's gotten larger, more inefficient, things aren't going well, we need more transparency. All that stuff's true. There's all kinds of things we can do to make it better. But the number one thing that hasn't changed is that the people still want a government to do things that are outside the jurisdiction of government.
Yep. Everybody wants to reduce the size and scope of government, but they don't want to reduce that part of the government that they depend upon. So I want to take a break and come back and just maybe get into a little bit more, because my commentary today was one where we were talking with Chuck Bentley about the fact that you have this idea of modern monetary theory. And I might even have, once again, when we come back from the break, maybe my producer, Steve, will put up this staggering pace of new debt, because it basically took 221 years to reach the national indebtedness of $12 trillion. But since 2020, we've added $12 trillion. And no matter whether we can have a little debate about how big or small the government can be, I think almost all of us would agree that if you look at the chart that we are posting right now, for those of you watching online, it is unsustainable. And so I want to get into that and talk about what that can mean for the future. And of course, if indeed we are dealing with some very significant and almost seemingly intractable problems, what can be done. But if you'd like to know a little bit more about David Bahnsen, first of all, we have a link on the website to his organization. We also have, of course, one very interesting interview he did with the Wall Street program on Fox News. And if you'd like to know more about the Bahnsen Group, it's all available on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Chuck Bentley is the CEO of Crown Financial and the host of the daily radio program My Money Life. He was on my radio program last week to talk about this question he received from a listener. That listener said, I am really concerned with what Elon Musk said about America headed towards bankruptcy. Do you think there's anything we need to do if he turns out to be correct? Well, Elon Musk was on a recent All-In Summit hosted by the All-In podcast in which he said, America is going bankrupt extremely quickly, and everyone seems to be sort of whistling past the graveyard on this one. Chuck Bentley attributes most of this problem to the promotion and popularity of what is called modern monetary theory. Now, the economists and politicians believe our currency is sort of like monopoly money. They argue that we can ignore deficits and ignore the growing national debt, that the government will always be able to print enough money to pay its debts. But he warns we're headed for a downward debt loop. Now, during the program, I explained that we weren't the only people concerned about this. Chuck Bentley quotes from an individual by the name of Les Rubin in an article who admitted the government can pay their loans due to their unlimited ability to borrow for now or to print more money, as long as other countries and investors will continue to buy our bonds. But then in the article, he warned that this will eventually stop and will have to default, leading to severe consequences. So both Chuck Bentley and I concluded that if Elon Musk and the proposed Government Efficiency Commission cannot reduce spending, then the economic future of this country isn't very bright. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation today with David Bahnsen. If you would like to know more about him, again, thebahnsen.com. Of course, we have a link there as well. Might even want to go to one of the sections I'm going to quote from, and that is the Dividend Cafe, because in that particular area, you give David a comprehensive post-election comment and a series of comments, and you're really dedicated, as you said, to calling balls and strikes as a citizen and a free thinker. That's kind of what you do. And yet one of the things that I just alluded to a minute ago that nobody seems to be talking about, neither presidential candidate talked about it in any of the debates. None of the moderators talked about the fact that we have a staggering increase of new debt, and that is unsustainable, and that should concern anybody, certainly you in the business world, but any American, because we seem to be adding more and more debt, and nobody seems to want to talk about it. Of course you do. So let's, if we can, get into what that might mean.
Well, and I think a lot of it that is not said enough is the point I was making previously about how it cuts into other optimal resources. And what I mean by this is the thing, if you think about a family and they have a certain income and they're going to get a bonus in the future, but they go run up some debt now. So they buy some things, vacations, TVs, furniture, things that are not adding to the productivity of the family, but they are enjoyable. Okay. And then you get the bonus later. You may feel like you got a bonus, but you're not able to grow from it. You're not any wealthier because you're just paying off debt you had. And yet the bonus should have been a good thing. See, what we're going to do as a country is we're going to do some good things because we got 330 million people. We have a lot of, productivity. We invent things, we create things, but all the debt we have is a lost future reward because when we have new growth in the future, it has to go to cover the old debt that we already incurred. Well, if you're running up your debt with the Hoover Dam, with winning World War II, with certain, science, technology, productivity enhancing things, some people might think it's worth it. Some people may not, but at least, there's a pretty good conversation to have there. There's a productivity out of some debt, but when the debt is entirely unproductive, then you're setting money on fire. And this is the problem with the debt level, is a lot of these guys have been screaming about the end of the world forever, would have said the same thing that we say now with $35 trillion in debt, $34 trillion ago. When we had $1 trillion in debt, they would have said the country's going to go bankrupt. And what my point is that even if you don't believe 35 trillion is a problem or 40 trillion is a problem or 50 trillion is a problem, because everybody who stays alive the next 10 years is going to see $50 trillion of debt.
Mm-hmm.
Think about what I just said.
That's amazing.
It's baked in the cake. There's nobody who doesn't know this. The problem is not necessarily that we're going to go bankrupt and extinct. It's that we're most certainly going to grow less than we otherwise would. So I find it morally unacceptable for baby boomers to say, no, everything's fine, when they're not planning to be here later. When they benefited from a society from World War II till about 15 years ago that grew over 3% per year, net of inflation. So to say it's fine when you're leaving your kids and grandkids with 1% growth or 2% growth, if we're lucky, because Japan went 30 years with 0% growth. And so that's why I kind of bother everybody on this topic, because I'm not willing to say I think the world's going to end. I don't agree that we're going to default on the debt. I do agree that what we do to avoid that comes at a cost. And that cost is paid by our kids and grandkids, and I find it immoral.
Well, you're going to have to make some choices, too, because you get to the point where once your interest, the payment, just paying the interest payments alone are comparable to the Defense Department, you get to the point where you say, well, eventually, unless we just keep printing money and debase the currency, we won't have enough dollars to pay Medicare, Medicaid, welfare payments, and the rest. And as you said, from George Washington to actually George W. Bush, $12 trillion, that might have been a good investment because we're talking about World War I, World War II, actually the Civil War and all sorts of other things. And we're talking about the interstate commerce and transatlantic railroads and all sorts of things. But now you're spending money just simply to service the debt. And eventually, if you don't print some more money, you run out of money, and then you can't meet the obligations that you made through things like the entitlement programs, do you?
Well, and that's the thing, is that Japan's debt, it was 250% of their size of their economy.
Yes.
Ours is about 100% of the size of our economy. It's way higher than the 60% we've averaged. But look, Apple has more debt than almost any company in the world, and I think most people would love to be in Apple's position. The issue is that their revenues and their assets are so much greater than the debt.
Right.
And that speaks to using debt productively versus unproductively. So that's why the debt to GDP, the debt relative to the size of the economy, is the most important thing. And for years and years, our national debt was growing, but our debt to GDP was not, because our economy was growing at a higher rate than the debt was. And this is where everything changed. When the growth of the debt is happening at a faster clip than the growth of the economy.
There you go.
That is That's unsustainable. That's what's happening. And so then the interest will not end up being more than the amount of military, because they will put downward pressure on interest rates as a means of controlling it. And that's what Japan has done. And that's most certainly what will happen here. And then people say, okay, well, then we're fine, right? No, because when you have artificially low interest rates, you distort what people do with their money.
Mm-hmm.
And it causes unproductive things to happen, when the whole point is we need productive things to happen. We need people doing smart things with their money, not dumb things with their money if we want to get economic growth.
Let's see if we can talk about that for just a minute, because I have a link to thebahnsen.com, and people are starting to say, okay, I want to do smart things with my money. We have a lot of uncertainty that existed before the election. Now we have the election of Donald Trump, but we still have some uncertainty around the world, and we certainly want to make smart decisions about our money. So again, if people go to your website, you have a podcast and you have all sorts of other resources so people can begin to think a little bit more carefully about how to invest their money for the future.
Well, and I believe it's important that people understand what they're doing when they're investing. And I happen to believe very strongly that God made human beings a certain way and made the world a certain way. And when I invest, I want to invest in what God made human beings capable of doing. So I don't get very excited about buying a government bond, but I get very excited about buying a business that meets the needs of humanity. And the goods and services that us human beings create on a daily basis, because God made us to do so, it excites me. And to use that capital for growth and for it to then generate the return that meets our own needs, I think it's a very virtuous cycle. And so we try to build investment around that. And it's not just our firm, it's really what all financial markets are intended to do. Nobody is interested in investing in something, at least not sustainably, just because they hope another sucker will buy it. You have to have something that's sustainable. And the greatest engine of sustainable growth ever invented is free market capitalism and the production of goods and services and innovative things that come from that. It's really very exciting, if you ask me.
Well, again, I want to, just before I let you go, to mention again that we have a link to thebahnsen.com if people want to contact you, listen to your blog and other posts that you have there. Lots of great resources. And most importantly, I just appreciate the fact that from time to time we do see you on Fox News or a variety of other venues, and appreciate the fact that first your father and now you have really stood up for a free market perspective. And it has been great to have you once again here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me. Enjoyed it very much.
Going to take a break, and if you'd like to know a little bit more, again, it's thebahnsen.com. I think you can find it there. We posted, of course, that staggering pace of new debt. Also, we posted, of course, spending more than quadruples. The government is spending more and more. Of course, you can be somewhat guardedly optimistic about Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, but I think there is a lot more that needs to take place. And the sad reality is, almost no one is running for Congress right now saying, you know, it's probably better for us to reduce the size and scope of government. Not many people win on that platform. Oh, there's a few, certainly Rand Paul and a few others, but the bottom line is that's what needs to happen. And of course, if you are concerned about the future, well, maybe it looks a little better because of who may be in the positions of power come January. But some of these, as we'll talk about just in a minute, are intractable problems that every administration will have to deal with. We'll talk about that right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back for the final half hour, and if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I thought for just a minute I would focus on one of those issues that would exist no matter who we elected in November. And I want to do these from time to time because I want you to understand that whether we elected Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, some of these problems don't go away. They are sort of rooted in our culture. In this case, it's rooted in our lack of fertility, which we'll talk about so many times we cover this issue. But again, it's an important topic to address because it affects so many others. And this piece by Edward Ring, I think, is a good example. But just before we get too far into it, let me just mention tomorrow we will have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford with us. Penn has probably written more on this topic than anyone, so we might even bring this topic up again, although we have quite a bit to talk about in terms of religious liberty, in terms of to vet or not to vet. That's a Cal Thomas piece about the vetting of some of these cabinet posts, what the government efficiency department may or may not be able to accomplish. And we did talk a little bit about that today, but we have another piece that will stimulate some of our discussion about that tomorrow. So I hope you'll join us. And of course, as you go to the website, you'll find some of the articles we've posted for today. I already have sent off the articles we're going to post for tomorrow, and I hope that these are resources that you can read so that as we cover them on the air, you have an article that you can print out, maybe read a little more carefully, maybe take the time to send it to an individual that you're having a conversation with, and those are resources we want to put in your hands. But let me come back to this because give me fertility or give me death. Seems like everybody's borrowing a quote here. That's, of course, give me liberty or give me death, but give me fertility or give me death is Edward Ring. And he first starts out by talking about this liberal feminist mindset. He says, for an estimated 2/3 of America's unmarried childless women, the November 5th election was about rejecting a candidate who exuded toxic masculinity, along with a rebellion against the Supreme Court that overruled their right to reproductive health care. Of course, we know what that means. And while these childless women and their candidate lost the election, they're winning a bigger war. They're leading us to extinction. Pretty strong words, but let's see what he has to say about that. He says, we now have tens of millions of American women who think unrestricted access to abortion is more important than prosperity, security, freedom, and world peace. And in alarming percentages, these women are not having babies. What this portends transcends politics and strikes at the very future of civilization. Because this has already happened, we've gone from a baby boom to a baby bust, and we've had lowering fertility rates. These don't change overnight. As a matter of fact, they don't even really change with the election of one president over another, or even with a different member of Congress over another. But he takes us to one of the studies that was done, according to Morgan Stanley, that estimate that by 2030, and recognize that we're about halfway there, almost, about 45% of women between the ages of 25 and 44 are projected to be single and childless. That's more than 21 million voters. He goes on to say, overall, single women of voting age make up 25% of the electorate, more than 40 million voters, and according to exit polls, 60% of the single women voted for Harris. But the point is that whether you like Donald Trump or not, whether you like Kamala Harris or not, when you don't have children and we don't have an increasing or at least stable fertility rate, and we have one that is declining precipitously, he makes the very obvious conclusion that we are a dying nation. You can see this if you've ever traveled with us. We are going to have a trip once again to Greece in May of next year, and we almost filled it out. We will probably talk about that sometime in the future, especially when I have one of my guests in studio, to talk about this, Paul Barreca. But if you go to Greece or you go to many of the countries surrounding it, whether it's Italy or Spain or a variety of others, you recognize that they have a fertility rate even further below the American rate. And as a result, they're not even replacing their population. You have a situation where there are more grandparents than parents, more parents than kids. And so he points out that we're not alone. The increasingly popular decision by literally billions of women is to opt out of motherhood, and that is happening throughout the developed world and most of the developing world. Perhaps the only continent where that is different is Africa, in which they have increased their population. And so if you take one of the countries in Africa, there each woman will bear about 6 children. In the United States, that number is 1.84. Now, I've never seen a 0.8 child. You haven't either, but you know how you get that number, and that is you take all the women of reproductive age, and then you divide that into the number of children being born, and you need about 2.1 to have a stable population. We have been below replacement value for many, many years. And as a result, if this isn't going to change, it might get worse, because he then points out the 4B movement. Now, I mentioned this the other day, but it's worth mentioning one more time. This is a feminist movement that's come out of South Korea, and South Korea are the 4 Bs. Now, the Bs are in Korean, so they wouldn't mean anything, so I'll translate them. One of the Bs is no sex with men, another B is no dating men, another B is no marrying men, and another one is not having children. And so if you look at that, that is something we're seeing even in this country being promoted, especially we're going to hear about that after, of course, the election of Donald Trump. So then he goes on to say it's easy to imagine how this movement resonates with liberal American women who are horrified or angry about Donald Trump's victory. But he says South Korea is not exactly the nation we would want to emulate. I did a commentary a while back because the fertility rate in South Korea for South Korean women is 0.68. They are trying as desperate as they can to find enough even men to serve in the South Korean military, because the population is literally collapsing. It's imploding on itself. So he concludes by simply saying this is the nihilistic consequence of a culture that rejects marriage, family, and motherhood. Whether mindful of the ultimate impact of their choices or not, this is the fate, he says, that liberal women are imposing on America. It is self-inflicted genocide occurring in what may appear to be slow motion from the perspective of our short lives, but in the context of human civilization, this is happening at a pace that is stunning and unprecedented. So again, he then goes into a piece, which you can read later because I'll ignore it, of a particular opinion column that was posted by a feminist. But in the conclusion, he says, you either start having babies again, or you import people, or you die. If we rule out option 3 and choose to live, the 2 choices remaining are equally clear. You stop celebrating a culture that stigmatizes masculinity and motherhood, and to the extent your population remains in decline, you screen every single aspiring immigrant to America for culture, character, intelligence, and work ethic, and only admit the best. The only thing I would add to this is the fact that we have found that, as we have said on this program many times before, conservatives have more children than liberals, Christians have more children than secularists, and the fertility gap is striking. I have a booklet coming out in the future, which I've already written. It isn't printed yet, but if you are one of the individuals that join with us financially, if you're part of the Truth Team, you'll receive it in the mail, probably January, February, whenever it comes out. But I talk about this fertility gap that we've had Arthur Brooks on the program to talk about. And the fertility gap, the last time I measured it, was like 47%. In other words, you basically have many more children being born in Christian homes than in secular homes, many more Christians being born, many more children being born, if you will, in conservative homes than liberal homes, and we're starting to see maybe some of the impact of that. The only thing that's changing that general direction is that a lot of universities are in the business of trying to convert conservative young children and young adults into liberals. But by and large, it is, I think, very striking that the one place where we see fertility, and you've probably noticed it, when we talk about the decrease in fertility in America, sometimes when you go to your church, you go, sure doesn't seem to be showing up right around here. We seem to have more babies in the nursery than ever before, and that's because Christians are having more children than secularists. Conservatives are having many more children than liberals. But this fertility issue is a big one, and it's going to exist long into the Trump presidency. And there are solutions, but we'd have to first acknowledge it's a problem. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I thought of going down with at least something that might give you a little bit of hope, and this comes from John Stossel. Now, actually, he's fairly negative, but I'm talking about the fact that now with a change of administration, maybe some things will begin to move in the right direction. Because if you, for example, want to keep your smartphone that requires various minerals. If you want to have an energy efficient car, maybe even electric car, that requires minerals. You can kind of see where I'm going with this, because he points out in his latest video, but also we have the column that goes with it, that he's actually a bit critical, I think, of the National Resources Defense Council, and does an interview with the head of it, so we'll get to that in just a minute. But this is a very affluent environmental group, and it claims to use the law to confront the climate crisis. And again, that's using his quotes. But he's concerned about the very significant way in which they go to actually prevent us, if you think about this, from getting the minerals necessary for the 21st century that we find ourselves in. Let me quote John Stossel. America needs minerals like copper and silver to make things. Even President Joe Biden made a speech saying America will need 400% to 600% more minerals to make solar panels, wind turbines, and so much more. And an iPhone alone needs aluminum, iron, lithium, gold, copper. Well, there you get a pretty good list right there. And so here's the problem. When investors want to dig up materials and minerals in America, that's when the National Resources Defense Council objects and uses all sorts of political connections to stop them. And that is, the argument is that these mines would be a catastrophic threat to wildlife or a fragile ecosystem. Now, first, let me just hasten to say, we don't want to do anything that is going to harm the environment. And I recognize that sometimes strip mines have been terrible things in our culture and in our environment. But to say that we could never actually mine these minerals in this country leads us to then say, well, then we'll just let all these various minerals be mined in places like Africa. And I've talked about the mining of cobalt in Africa in one of my commentaries and some of the rest. And so here is the problem. So in order to try to kind of give a counterpoint, John Stossel first talks with Mark Mills, who's a physicist. And he says, Mark Mills wonders why anyone would try to open a mine in America today. The physicist says, why in the world would you put millions, maybe billions of dollars at risk, spending those decades to get a permit, knowing there's a very good chance they'll just cancel the permit? How in the world do you build mines in America knowing that that's the landscape you have? And in the video, you can watch it, John Stossel talks about a place where there was an EPA veto against a mine, and then the Army Corps of Engineers studied the mine and concluded there wasn't an environmental threat, but then it was reversed again. So you can see that this on again, off again that comes from changing administrations, Republican, Democrat, now we're going to Republican again. If you're a business person, if you're an individual who wants to invest in this and you can't be sure that you are going to be able to get a return on your investment, you can see why we have the problem. So John Stossel then reports that America now ranks second to last in the time it takes to develop a new mine, 29 years. Only Zambia has a worse record than that. And so again, the physicist Mark Mills said, you start applying for permits, you're going to be waiting not months, not years, but possibly decades. And you can see why that's the case, because you've been going to be waiting, and while the National Resources Defense Council sues and raises all sorts of concerns about that. And so as a result, today's mines deserve, as he points out, a very small amount of the landscape. But nevertheless, that's the game that is being played right now to prevent mining, in many cases, from taking place in America. Okay, so then John Stossel talks with the spokesman for the National Resources Defense Council, Bob Deans, who actually was confronted by the fact that it seems to be killing minds and also killing people's opportunity. He comes back with kind of the typical platitude you hear before. We've created new jobs in this country by building wind turbines, solar panels, even the next generation of energy-efficient cars, but again, I point out, but you also need copper and gold, but we have to weigh the risk. But that's when he says, but they don't seem to really be weighing the risks. As a matter of fact, he even asked whether or not the National Resources Defense Council can provide a list of any mines that the NRDC doesn't complain about. He says, sure, I'll send you some names. Never did. I asked again this month, again, never any names. And that's where, of course, Mark Mills says, don't hold your breath. The mines that they are implicitly supporting are in, you know it, Africa. So again, this is, I think, a very interesting irony. And on the one hand, there's a full court press for everything from wind turbines and solar panels. Of course, everybody wants their smartphone, but these minerals have to come from somewhere. And at the moment, we as Americans are quite content to just say, don't dig in this country. We'll just dig in Africa, even though we recognize it's exploiting some of the labor that is there. So again, I think you would appreciate reading that piece, and just a good reminder once again of the fact that the issues are a little more complex than sometimes you're led to believe. Just before I go, I thought I'd also quote from Matt Taibbi. He's an individual we quote from time to time, used to write for Rolling Stone magazine, but he points out the other day that the Washington Post was criticizing this particular doctor from Stanford University and talked about his fringe ideas on COVID. Matter of fact, they talked about the fact that he was a handful of prominent contrarian academics. But I love Matt Taibbi says, only the Washington Post would use snobbish terms like fringe and contrarian to describe beliefs held by most of the population. And it's, again, one more, I think, very poignant reminder of the fact that you have to read carefully, you have to read widely, and in some respects, read with a great deal of discernment, because the number of times words like fringe, far right, contrarian, of course, not to mention fascist and Hitler are used, you just have to pay attention to the fact that sometimes they're just name-calling. They're not really engaging in the actual facts and figures and information. So I thought it was an interesting little piece that came from Matt Taibbi. He's an individual who on many issues probably would disagree with us as a liberal, but he's kind of had it up to his eyebrows with the dishonesty of the so-called mainstream press or the legacy press, and is a good reason for us to encourage you to pay attention to facts and figures, and I hope that we can be your trusted source of news, information, and commentary right here at Point of View. Again, we have a banner there for Giving Tuesday, which is just around the corner. Hope you may be thinking about and praying about how you would support this ministry, and hope that you will join us tomorrow. Looking forward to a very long and robust conversation with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter, and of course, we'll open up the phones for your comments as well. It's all part of our weekend edition right here at Point of View. You can find all the articles we're talking about here on the website at pointofview.net. And most importantly, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
There is an old military saying, if you don't have communications, you don't have anything. Good information is the key to success, not only for those in the military, but for all of us. You can't take positive, productive, and helpful action if you don't have good information. Point of View Radio's main role is to provide good information, and we distribute that information not only here through our radio program, but online and through our various social media channels. You know that big tech isn't exactly a supporter of what we do, so you need to take intentional steps to keep in touch with us. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at Point of View RTS, which of course stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show, at Point of View RTS. Also, make sure you follow us on Facebook, Point of View Radio Talk Show. We won't overwhelm you, usually just one post a day with information on our guests and what's important. The information you need when you need it. Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook and at Point of View RTS on Twitter. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.